Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic's world-leading command and control software, the Citaware suite, is in use in 16 NATO countries and more than 50 militaries worldwide. Its open architecture allows complete integration with legacy systems while meeting all NATO interoperability standards, and its intuitive interface bridges language and domain barriers across alliances.
So far, our focus has been on military command and control, and there's still much to cover in that area. But there's also a key aspect of command which relates to how politics and C2 intermesh. Now, there's a considerable amount of literature, research, scholarly work about this topic, civ-mil relationships. But the recent stuff all makes it feel quite remote, relying on the Iraq and Afghan eras to try and make sense of how the two worlds, politics and the military, work effectively together. What is harder is to understand how it might differ between the worlds of counterterrorism, expeditionary warfare, counterinsurgency civ-mil relations, and what might be required in great power competition. Indeed, are they different at all? Given that there seems an aversion to politicians learning lessons about civ-mil relations from contemporary conflicts, for some interesting highlights on C2 in major combat operations in Western memories, we need to go back to major campaigns of great power conflict. Whether World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the behaviours of leaders were certainly more heated, more passionate, increasingly stressed, perhaps not surprising given what was at stake. But the lessons and underpinning cultures don't seem that different from what we find in more recent Western campaigns, albeit at a much smaller and less vital scale. We can't ignore this facet of the C2 debate either. As so many of our guests have pointed out, the political imperatives play a huge role in command and control and about warfare in toto. So what we really need to do is to dive into it, and not from a military perspective either. To tackle this properly, we need a politician who spanned national interest, inter-sovereign discussions, crisis management, major war, coalition tensions and interpersonal relationships. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Jaap Scheffer, the former Secretary-General of NATO between 2004 and 2009, a period of NATO alliance expansion, the Russian invasion of Georgia, operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, a divided political picture in Europe between old and new Europeans, and an increasingly distracted at the time United States. Yeah, listen, welcome to the show. Can I start by asking you about your relationship with the military members of NATO, maybe the chairman of the military committee during your time as SecGen? I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, you had three: a German, Harold Kudrut, a Canadian, Raymond Hanold, and an Italian, the well-known Gianpaolo De Paola. Two aviators and a sailor, no less. How much did you see them and the other military members, or were you dealing the majority of your time with just politicians?
No, I saw them frequently. All three of them, certainly number two and number three, because the German chairman military committee left relatively briefly after I started. But they were a sounding board for me, as I think as SecGen of NATO was a sounding board for them. We both have different responsibilities. It's not the direct chain of command you're discussing. I mean, when I discuss Kosovo or Afghanistan, you are in the chain of command and you're more doing business with the commanders and with the Supreme Allied Commander Europe than with the chair people of the military committee. But still, I reuse the word sounding board. Very relevant for a Secretary General of NATO to hear what's going on in the military committee, i.e. what's going on in the NATO allies at home in their respective capitals in the military domain. And for them, of course, to meet the civilian head of NATO, a man in my case, up till now, unfortunately, always men with a political past, acting like a politician. So when you discuss Paul Mill inside the alliance, this is very much one of the more valuable contacts.
And how did their relationships with you differ from that sort of relationship you had with, the Supreme Allied Commander? Particularly because you were running operations, or he was running operations on behalf of the North Atlantic Council at the time. I mean, how did that differ?
Well, it differs. First of all, let us conclude that it was, of course, between 2004 and 2009, a different NATO. It was a NATO which I qualify as an expeditionary NATO. While now, after Putin's invasion into Ukraine, we go back to, quote unquote, the old NATO. But then it was very expeditionary. Let me give you one example. It was very complicated, also for political reasons, by the way, to establish an acceptable command structure for the ISAF operation in Afghanistan. Because for political reasons, many allies were not fond of Operation Enduring Freedom, and they thought those two operations should be disconnected, also when it concerned command and control. Now, that was quite a challenge, I can tell you, until Jim Jones, General James Jones, the former Marine commandant, later National Security Advisor of President Obama, found a solution. I remember him sitting with all kinds of papers in my office, if we do it like this or if we do it like that, overcoming political hurdles with the help of the military and with the help, in my case, of a very inventive, intelligent Supreme Allied Commander. That's where politics and the military meet. Do not forget that in the beginning of the Afghanistan operation, we saw non-US commanders of the operation. We had a Turkish commander, we had a UK commander. Then, of course, the Americans took over, and I can't deny that as the years progressed, Operation Enduring Freedom and ISAF, I'm not going to say merged, but they came closer together, to say it in diplomatically correct language. Interesting as well was, and that's why this Afghanistan operation is worth discussing, that formally, and then I come back to your initial question, formally, the NATO headquarters in Brunsum in the Netherlands was responsible for running the Afghanistan operation. But the more and more Enduring Freedom and ISAF merged, the Americans, as they did rather frequently, bypassed Brunsum and used their own chain of command, which is, of course, not so surprising given the fact that there was an American four-star commanding the operation, that the Americans preferred to have their national chain of command in running the Afghanistan operation. Then I came in, Paul Mill we are discussing after all, Peter, aren't we? Then I came in. I mean, when Allies started complaining, when Brunsum started complaining, they did that also, of course, through national channels to the military committee and to me, and then I had to keep the flock together to see that things weren't getting out of hand. So you mentioned an element in your introduction, which is of great importance here, I think, and that is personal relationships. You need to be able to pick up the phone and to call SecGen on the Sunday night at 10:30 p.m. because a problem comes up, because one of the ambassadors calls me and says, Jaap, it's going wrong, and I told you so, and why are the Americans doing this? Anyway, you can imagine the situation I was in rather frequently.
And yeah, there's one of those things is interesting that you end up coming up with a bespoke command and control relationship. NATO has a very established structure. It did through the Cold War. It was very set. We knew where it was. We knew what to rely on. We knew who we were answerable to. But more and more of these expeditionary operations showed the ability for NATO to be far more flexible in command and control terms, something that sometimes is quite hard to get over to quite a staid military. Do you feel that the politicians were sort of, yeah, that's fine, go with it? Were they much more flexible and open to it, or was there some sort of tension there as well?
Finally, the conclusion was at the end, go for it. But do not underestimate, and I'm coming back to Afghanistan again, because I think that's the best example, that the word war was a taboo in many allied nations for quite some time after the ISAF operation started. In Germany, it was an absolute taboo. In the Netherlands, in Parliament, it was about a reconstruction operation, help building up Afghanistan, and so on and so forth, until too many guys were coming back in body bags. And then parliamentarians and politicians realized there's a war going on at thousands of miles of the original NATO territory. And the fact that it was a war, but a special type of war, not the war NATO had been preparing itself for in the Cold War, with the established command structures, as you indicated, that finally, politics and politicians had to accept that we needed bespoke solutions, because we had never run in NATO in Afghanistan a military operation with 100,000 plus boots on the ground in a faraway nation like Afghanistan. So it was indeed bespoke and not just going into the shop and pick a suit as it was available. But again, there was certainly Paul Mill tension, but I would conclude perhaps more political tension than military tension. Because I'll go one step further, Peter, in stating that I think in retrospect, the military was so successful in Afghanistan, certainly in the beginning, that politicians, and I've been one myself for a great number of years in the Netherlands, that politicians said, oh, well, wait, the military are doing very well. Let's not involve ourselves too much. You see what I mean? I mean, the military were doing military things, but they're also doing other things linked to reconstruction. I mean, the military were repairing water supplies and building schools. After all, the provincial reconstruction teams were a sort of pull-mill combination in the beginning. So the success of the military gave the politicians, I'm phrasing it perhaps a bit too strongly now, an alibi to stay a bit out of the debate and out of the discussion. And the interesting thing is that NATO, of course, has been over the years very much involved in Afghanistan. But if you look at the priority, or perhaps I should say the lack of priority in the European Union, that's exactly what I mean. I mean, there was, let's say at a certain stage, certainly a lack of political ambition, although the military interest was huge and the military did a great job.
What's interesting, knowing your background, hearing you talk, is actually you were, as a sort of career civil servant and then politician, you were seriously aware of military capabilities, military behaviours. You strike me as someone, when you took office as SecGen, as being really aware of what the military could do, of how they functioned. Perhaps that's less true in other states, in other countries, and other times. Do you think that throughout your early career that you had a insight into the military that allowed you to take on this position with a certain confidence that other politicians today just don't seem to have? They seem to be much more wary, to use your words, to use the military as an alibi, to step back from it. But actually, you seem very comfortable operating with the military at that level.
I was and I am. I was when we still had conscription in the Netherlands. We might have it again at a certain stage. I don't exclude that. But again, I was an officer in the Royal Dutch Air Force, traveling around the Air Force, then already as a young second lieutenant, explaining to the military about geopolitics and the Cold War and what have you. So I've never flown an aircraft or something, but I've always been close to the military in the sense that my final university thesis had as a topic the American military presence in Europe. And the Americans then already complaining, and I'm now talking about the late 60s, early 70s of the previous century, the Americans then already, of course, complaining about the fact that Europeans didn't pay sufficiently and so on and so forth. So I've always been rather close to the military as a parliamentarian. I had a portfolio as a spokesman for Paul Mill Affairs. So yes, if you ask me the question, was I relatively comfortable in dealing with the military, my answer is a clear yes. I think I've always been in touch also with former military officers through think tanks and what have you. So I definitely did not come in as a rookie at NATO in 2004. No.
I would say, for me, looking at externally, that seems to be one of the reasons why you had the successes that you had, and you were able to identify some of the key patterns, like the change in Russian attitudes, the key moment of the Russian invasion of Georgia, and you were to bring those things out. Some of the other politicians didn't seem to agree with you much over that. There seemed to be a very real divide, and you clearly had to walk a fine line when talking for NATO about things like Russia at the time, right? But it allowed you to understand some of that more complex picture, something that I guess other ambassadors to NATO wouldn't have got or understood as deeply as you did.
Well, I think that's a rather fair description. Talking about divides, the big divide when I came into NATO in January 2004, of course, was the huge gap in the aftermath of the Bush invasion into Iraq. I was the Dutch foreign minister, as you know, in 2002-03, so I went through the whole thing, supporting with the Dutch government Bush politically, not militarily participating though. And I remember very well that during my introductory visits to Washington, D.C., Paris, Berlin, and London, the main instruction, quote unquote, I got was you're going to heal the rift. That's your first priority in NATO as a consequence of the Bush invasion into Iraq in 2003. I must admit immediately when I say this that something interesting happened as soon as I started. The message from President Bush was, listen, NATO guys, listen, SecGen, I need to have my eye on the ball in Iraq. So you're going to alleviate my responsibility in Afghanistan because I can't do both full steam. And you, allies, dear NATO allies, dear NATO friends, you're going to do something for me I would highly appreciate. You are going to, and I always remember the words of Nick Burns, then American US NATO ambassador, now ambassador in Beijing for the Biden administration, we're going to deploy counterclockwise the so-called provincial reconstruction teams. That's how it all started. That was point A for the NATO involvement, the alliance involvement in Afghanistan. And then I had very much to have my eye on the ball there, diving, of course, again, as I had done for a long time in my career on a national level, diving again into politics, as you say. But with an essential, absolutely essential role for my success were the military. Had the military failed, politicians would have failed as well. So I needed a good relationship. I needed, in my own interest, as the civilian head of NATO, I needed full cooperation with the military, close relations with the military. I had a close personal relationship with the military. I am very much a believer in personal relationships with the military. I had a very close relationship with Jim Jones. I already described him, mentioned him earlier in the podcast. And that developed into a relationship not only of General Jones and myself, but also of my spouse and Mrs. Jones, ending, to give you an example, ending with an invitation of General Jones for my whole family to go to USS Eisenhower and to spend a day on an aircraft carrier, just as an example how close that relationship was and how I could call General Jones Sunday night at 11:30 p.m. when there was a problem. So the building of the personal relationships, that goes even more directly with the Supreme Allied Commander, with the SecGen than with the Chairman MC, although there I also had good personal relationships, is in my opinion key for the proper functioning of the alliance.
And did you see a big difference between, we tend to think, particularly in European ways, perhaps in American ways too, of these big differences in behaviours and culture between the sort of military community and the political one? Both of them see each other as not poles apart, but very different sort of communities. But it doesn't come across that you felt that when you met them and interacted with these guys at the top, that you didn't feel that there was this great divide between you that we experience in so many of the European capitals today.
No, I didn't feel that. As you said before, perhaps that's part of my DNA. And when you don't have that sort of DNA, you don't have those genes, it might be more complicated. I always made it a point, wherever I went, to NATO capitals or partner capitals, that I met the military. I always met the top, an essential figure, of course, in the life of a Secretary General, given the fact that the military committee does play a very important political advisory role to the political authorities within NATO. But again, I think it's in my DNA, and I have never felt any undue pressure or whatever from the military, although I must also admit that they were, from time to time, also in the NAC, the North Atlantic Council, complaining about a certain lack of political support. Look, what was one of the key challenges in Afghanistan, that was that I had at a certain stage a coalition of 50 nations, NATO allies, partners, from Japan to the UAE, and you know what? They came together from time to time. So that was already quite a complicated group. But what we never overcame as NATO, and I think that was important for the military, what we did not manage properly, also to be a bit self-critical, was that all those actively participating nations, certainly the NATO allies, were looking to Afghanistan through their national straw. For the Brits, Afghanistan was Helmand. For the Dutch, it was Uruzgan. For the Italians, it was the West. For the Germans, it was Mazar. For the Americans, it was the East. And that was difficult. And when I asked, I remember, and when we had discussions, I should say, about what is our mandate, and there was discussion about poppy culture and the Taliban making huge sums of money with the drugs trade. Then the nations responsible for provinces, when there was no poppy trade, they said, well, that's not within our mandate. Why should we bother? And then the other nations came and said, yeah, what the heck? I have huge problems in my quote unquote province because of this poppy thing, you see? And that led to uncertainty from time to time in the sense of what are we basically doing there? I mean, on the general lines, of course, there was agreement. In the NAC, there was agreement. But when I went to Afghanistan and visited the different provinces, I saw that there was a difference in approach.
So I want to pull on two threads there, which are interesting. First one is decision making, and I'll come back to that one about how you did it across the alliance, almost on the political level, and they're advised by their military team themselves. I want to come back to that. But I just want to pull on this thread about the domestic versus international tensions. National governments often find this. Prime ministers are caught between national pressures and international foreign policy dilemmas, and these things don't align or agree. But across NATO, you had a series of ambassadors and national agendas, not just in Afghanistan, but it might have been about spending and national security plans, about military recapitalization, about enablers, and all this stuff going on. And then you had the sort of view of NATO as an alliance, as a group. Did you find that political leaders in NATO were able to take that higher level? Or was it just you alone thinking about NATO as an organization, as the alliance, and anyone on a national level was having to prioritize their own sovereign thoughts first?
This is always a mixed picture. And one should not forget, I always try to explain to my students at university here in the Netherlands, that NATO, of course, is an alliance of, as we speak, 32 sovereign states, sovereign nations. NATO has no majority voting. NATO has and only knows consensus. Having said that, every single NATO ally and every single national politician, including myself when I was one, I realized the truth in Tip O'Neill's saying, all politics is local. And at the end of the day, all politics is local. And they all have and had their local worries. Do not forget that we were still cashing the peace dividend. We're talking about 04, 09 in my case. And the wall had fallen. We had subcontracted our security as Europeans to the US, our energy to Russia, and I would almost say the rest to China. We were sitting on the beach with a nice glass of cold white wine and thought we have arranged it quite nicely. Remember Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. If I have to qualify the period we're going through now, it is the end of history, I think. We stood up with a big bang. Anyway, still cashing peace dividend in those years. So the financial argument, you had a political argument, you had a financial argument. The financial argument always was, listen, we have over the past decades cut our spending so much that the Dutch army or the Bundeswehr or whatever, we are not capable of delivering more forces for the Afghanistan operation. And I had to go around with a begging bowl, I can tell you. I felt like a beggar from time to time, visiting capitals and asking for more forces. Then you had, as we discussed, you had the caveats. My forces will not be allowed to, etc. And then there came a number of caveats. You had the domestic policies. We're not talking about the war. If you start talking about the war, we might review our support for the operation. I'm now referring to Germany and the Netherlands again, but also other NATO allies. I mean, in the parliamentary debate where you would qualify this as a war operation, speaking for my own country, the foreign and defense ministers and the prime ministers would not survive a discussion for more forces. So, I mean, there was always, and there is always, a huge, let's say, domestic source over political decision-making in NATO. And I have to add here, and you referred indirectly to it earlier in our conversation, that you must realize that up till this very moment, as we speak, there has never been inside NATO / inside the European Union, but we're discussing NATO now, a consensual Russia policy. It simply does not exist. And do not forget, and there I feel pity for the present German Chancellor Scholz, imagine what it means when, as a social democratic German chancellor, after the Putin invasion, you have to bury decades of German Ostpolitik. that is enormous in political terms. And for Germany, the relationship between Berlin and Moscow is almost as important as the relationship between Berlin and Paris. And we tend to forget that the approach vis-à-vis the Russians has always been different inside NATO, and it is up till this very day. Up till this very day, there is much less appetite in Madrid or in Athens or in Ankara or in Rome, comfortably far away from the Ukrainian battlefields. I don't even blame them, but geography matters, as we all know, in military and foreign policy. And when you go to the Baltic states or to Poland, you'll find a totally different approach. But that different approach leads to a non-consensual policy. And now leaving Afghanistan for a moment, that, for instance, vis-à-vis Russia, Putin, 2007, the Munich Security Conference, 2008, the invasion into Georgia, that let bare the difference of opinion in the alliance. And let me certainly not forget to mention the Bucharest summit in 2008, where I did not have my finest hour because there was a big fight between President Bush and Chancellor Merkel on Ukraine and NATO. And up till this very day, we haven't solved that problem.
So from all of that, there are these disagreements, these tensions, these national agendas. But it was your responsibility to pull coherence and consensus in decision-making from the NAC. Is that just about going to the lowest common denominator, something very frustrating in military terms, that you go for the one that everyone can sign up to? Or is there a way of looking at decision-making? Did you look at decision-making for NATO in a different way that said, okay, we can work within this, we've got to try and find a way? Or is it simply a case with the number of states you had, and you had a whole new number of states who joined the alliance at that time, that you could just only go for the lowest common denominator sort of decision-making rubric?
Not necessarily. Although in politics, as I know, a compromise approaches the lowest common denominator quite often. But let's go to NATO and to the pull-mill relationship. If you have a closed front between the military and the political wings of NATO, so to speak. In other words, if you have sound and strong military advice coming from the military committee, if you have sound and strong advice aligned with the military committee by the Supreme Allied Commander, by the chain of command, the NATO chain of command, if that is supported by the international staff in the person finally of the Secretary General of NATO, you have a rather strong position in trying to seeing through and getting accepted what you want. And the second big plus the Secretary General of NATO has, although, as you know, you have no formal powers to say, I've heard you all, this is the way we go. You're not the CEO of Shell PLC or Unilever for that matter. Although you don't have those powers and you have to get it from your authority, political authority, moral authority, your experience. In the case I'm describing, you have a fairly strong position. And what I want to add in my argumentation is you hold the pen. You write, you make proposals. Of course, capitals can also make proposals. But if you have made an inventory of everything you have on your table in the NATO building, and the NAC is the next day or the day after, it's up to you and your staff to draft the proposal you go to the NAC with. But again, you need full military support, you need full military advice. Certainly in my days, where it was expeditionary and there were so many boots on the ground and wars were being fought. I mean, there's a horrible war going on in Ukraine, but NATO is not waging war. I don't envy Jens Stoltenberg, and I have the greatest respect for the fact that he's now in his position for 10 years. It must be quite strenuous and heavy for him by now after so many years. But again, the basics of NATO do not change. You have the pen, and anytime you like, you can come up with a compromise. Anytime you like, you can call an ambassador. Anytime you like, and the phone will always be picked up, you can call a prime minister or a president. If you find it necessary to call the president of the United States, you can do it. And he'll take up the phone. at the end of the day. So will the German Chancellor. You should not do that too often, of course, but you can do it. And people know that you can do it and that the phone will be picked up on the other side. So, no, I would certainly not go for the opinion it is always the lowest common denominator. Things can be difficult, and you have always spoilers in the room. At the moment, we have one big spoiler sitting somewhere in the eastern part of the alliance, throwing spanners in the works from time to time. But then again, it is to a large extent, again, do you have a personal relationship with the guy, usually the guy, not the girl, which is troublesome? And can we have a drink or can we have a dinner in solving that matter? In classical terms, you have the oil can oiling the works and oiling the machine and seeing that you keep your flock together. That's your main responsibility as a Secretary General, and in that flock, the military are very much involved.
So listen, we are really hard up against it and with your time. But there's one question that I do want to put to you, because we were talking there about the difference in fighting a war and when NATO has boots on the ground and they are engaged. How much do you feel that you need to be on top of the picture? How much do you feel that during Afghanistan you wanted a day-by-day sit-rep of what was happening? Do you need this stuff in real time? Does that influence your decisions on a day-to-day basis? How much do the politics need to get involved in the military at the lower levels? Is it just an awareness? Is there something that influences discussions and conversations?
No, it's much more. I remember, Peter, going downstairs in my residence in Brussels every morning, and then on the whole table was the casualty report. What had happened in Afghanistan, usually, of course. Well, that was not nice reading from time to time. And it made me realize that we are talking about people. Boys, young boys coming back in body bags, but also a NATO aircraft misfiring a missile and killing innocent women and children. And then I had the president of Afghanistan on the line. I should finish with this anecdote. I think how important it is. And President Karzai in those days then used to call me very emotional that a NATO aircraft had misfired a missile or whatever. Unverifiable, of course. But that was the news he got. And then he called me. Those were very unpleasant telephone conversations. And the reason that I wanted to be informed in rather much detail about the military operations and what had gone right and what had gone wrong. And that relationship was very strained until President Karzai, in one of those telephone conversations, asked me, "Your wife, isn't she a French teacher?" I said, "Yes, Mr. President, my wife is a French teacher. Why don't you bring her along next time you come to Afghanistan so she can give a few guest lectures at Kabul University, where they have a French section?" I didn't know about that. Anyway, to cut a long story short, my wife joined me in flying to Afghanistan, flak jacket and all, after permission of our children. She gave guest lectures, and what did Karzai then do? He invited my wife and myself into his very inner circle in the palace with his wife and his baby son, and we had tea together. I could never have been invited in his inner circle without my wife being there, given his religion and his culture. And from that moment on, our relationship flipped completely to the other side. And we were on a friendly basis. We could tell each other the truth. And he was important, very important for me, and I was very important for him, because I was the face of those 100,000 plus forces, but also of girls going to school in Afghanistan. Just by way of an anecdote, to underline once again how important personal relationships are and how important it was for my morale, but also my moral judgment, to see that piece of paper on my whole table every single day in Brussels.
Jaap, thank you so much for taking the time to give us your thoughts and share with us those experiences and stories. It really much appreciated, so much in thinking, or help us think about the wider issues over command and control, particularly at that level where we often, as military people engaged in this conversation, we sort of discount the politics as something that happens up there. It's sort of unimaginable. It really helped us put that in perspective. Thanks very much. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
SitAware is the world's #1 force integration solution, providing full C4 ISR capability across the globe.
We hope you enjoyed the show, as well as telling your friends and colleagues about it. Please do subscribe and leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming platforms. This really helps us to reach new audiences and spread the word. The episode is produced by aureliusthinking.com as a show for the Waiver Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.